Last year, according to an article in the Washington Post by Daniel Williams, and I'm quoting now, gunmen in a car chased Pamela Constable down a road in southern Iraq, evidently trying to kidnap or rob her. Her driver raced into a nearby hamlet where an Arab family took her in. Most of the time, what foreign correspondents go through to get the story you read in your morning newspaper is never recorded. For the tradition is to keep yourself out of the story. And what I've just read to you was by no means Pam's closest call. But when it comes time to write a book, it's quite different. And what you will hear about today and hopefully read in Fragments of Grace is an intensely personal memoir of being a correspondent, foreign correspondent, in a strange land. And Pamela Constable is a consummate foreign correspondent. I'm in a position to know, as she graced our small but highly professional foreign service when we both worked for the Boston Globe. She left the Globe to join the Washington Post just as I had moved the other way some years before. It's a restless trade. One time I got a phone call from Pam from Washington, said she was going to be in Boston and she'd like to talk to me about some career moves. And I said, okay, would you meet me for breakfast on such and such a day? And she called up Kathy Talbot, whose job at the Washington Post she's about to take as Kathy's moved on. And she said to Kathy, Greenway's invited me for breakfast, but if I were a man, it would be lunch, wouldn't it? I mean, isn't this kind of an insult? And Kathy wisely said, well, Pam, you've been abroad too long to know about power breakfasts. And besides, Greenway only has a few good hours in the morning left. You can read this book as a journalistic briefing, and indeed her concise descriptions of the politics and history of those troubled and exotic lands of the subcontinent is as good as I've read. But behind this, you get a glimpse of what it is like to be constantly on a call for a big story. The interrupted vacations, even interrupted dinner parties when you have to race to the airport to get on the road. The loneliness of waking up in 1,000 hotel rooms, the grit, dirt, and danger of getting the story, the obfuscating officials and the politicians who, as Pam writes, have their litany of old arguments and grievances ready to trot out, and each has created a version of history from which he could never retreat. And then there's the body of your friends and colleagues in blood-spattered morgues. There's the adrenaline rush of a great story, the intense satisfaction of getting it into the paper, but against a background of what might have been a certain regret. To her friends and her family, Pam writes, I've become a name above a story, a postcard with an exotic stamp, a static-filled phone call of congratulations or condolence. Pam could have lived a conventional, comfortable New England life, a house and children in Connecticut, summers on Nantucket. But she chose a different course. She followed the siren song of faraway exotic places. And what more exotic than the backdrop for this book, the Indian subcontinent? Constable, like Kipling, longed for somewhere east of Suez where the best is like the worst and there ain't no 10 commandments and a man can raise a thirst. Into all that heat and dust, wars and cruelty and religious fanaticism, Pam has managed to find some meaning in the vicissitudes, the inequalities, and the unfairness of life, and even some fragments of grace.
Coming from my former boss, those are very touching words. Thank you. I thought I should start with a joke. This is a little ditty that was composed for me 22 years ago when I made my fateful leap from the Baltimore Sun to the Boston Globe. It was written by a Bostonian, a waggish journalist, and it went something like this. Here's to dear old Boston, home of the Bean and the Constable, where Lowells speak only to Cabots, which some people find quite remonstrable. I thought I would never again have a chance to repeat that, and this might be the occasion. Where to begin? I'm thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled to be in this beautiful place, a place that was made for meditation and reflection on life. And I'm thrilled to see all of you, especially my parents who've driven up from Connecticut to be here. I don't see them terribly often, and it's very nice to have them at this occasion. I see a few other old friends here as well, so this is really a special treat. I'm going to read a few passages from the book, but not enough, I hope, to bore you. And in between, I'll talk a little bit about each place I've been, some of the experiences I've had. As David suggested in his introduction, probably most people would pick up this book thinking it's going to be about India or Pakistan or Afghanistan. The truth is it's a book about me. It's a book about everything I've seen and done in my life as a foreign correspondent. But more than that, it's about the impact it had on my life. It's a book that's between the lines. It's a book that's about everything that did not appear in the Boston Globe or the Washington Post as I was traveling through very difficult, conflicted circumstances. In a way, the excuse for writing this book is the public events that I witnessed, and the reason for writing this book is the private epiphanies that this experience led to. So I thought I would read a little bit from the prologue, because the prologue gives you a very a good idea of what I set out to do in the book. Every book is like a child. Giving birth to one is a lonely labor, surrounded by busy, reassuring paraphernalia, but inevitably reduced to one thing: you, staring into a vast, empty desert, groping for the words and strength and inspiration to carry you across. Every book has a moment of conception. This one was conceived on Thanksgiving Day 2001 in Jalalabad, Afghanistan. I was camped in a frigid hotel with 40 other foreign journalists. It had been a grim and gloomy week. 4 of our colleagues had been ambushed and shot dead on a highway. At the moment it happened, I was driving 500 yards behind their taxi, chatting with a television reporter about the addictive thrill of covering wars and revolutions, about what kept drawing us to new life and death struggles in places no one could pronounce. This time we had barely escaped with our lives. One of the dead men was a friend, a Pakistani photographer named Aziz Hedri. It fell to me to identify his body in the hospital morgue. When I looked down at his bruised and barely recognizable face, I realized I was staring at a death that could easily have been my own. I imagined my face in the coffin, my family being told the news, my memories and dreams shipped home in a box. I knew that night that I needed to write this book. I have spent most of the past 2 decades hopping among global trouble spots, immersed in societies as they struggled with dictatorship, poverty, revolution, religious strife. My passport is crammed with exotic visas to Castro's Cuba, Pinochet's Chile, to Tamil Tiger and Taliban territory, to the fall of Marcos and the rise of Aristide, to earthquakes in India and assassinations in Nepal. I have journeyed with refugees and rebels, religious pilgrims and circus elephants. I have lived an extraordinary life. But it has come, perhaps unavoidably, at a high cost. I have hurt and abandoned people who loved me, and I've often been very lonely. I've seen very little of my family and old friends over the years. I've missed weddings and funerals, baptisms and graduations. My visits home have been few and brief, usually just a week or two at Christmas in Connecticut, and another in a cottage on Virginia's eastern shore. My parents are older now, and we don't have much time left. I've also never done the one thing I was built to do. I have cheated biology year after year, taking one more trip, one more foreign assignment, afraid that having a child would tie me down, sap my energy, and change me into someone else. Now, at 50, the choice is no longer mine. So what then have I accumulated in this peripatetic pilgrimage? What have I learned of lasting value? What do I have to say that is more meaningful than the sum of 2,000 newspaper articles? There is a strong single thread that runs through my journeys, a search for human dignity and hope in the stories of anonymous people struggling to survive in places that seem God-forsaken. This idea has sustained and inspired me through nearly 3 decades as a journalist, and it has gathered focus and momentum as I have explored the spiritual but very conflicted worlds of Hinduism and Islam. It has been a search in the ruins for fragments of grace. So I set out to write a book that I hoped would give meaning, personal meaning, to the adventures and the public journalism that I have been involved in over the years. And what I want to do is talk a little bit about each of the places I've been in these recent years. Very, very diverse circumstances, some horrific, others very redeeming. The first place I want to talk about is Afghanistan. When I first went to Afghanistan in 1998, the Taliban regime was still in power there. And it was a regime that certainly did not welcome people like me. In fact, I would say it reviled everything I stood for. I was a woman, I was a Christian, I was a Westerner, and I was a journalist. All 4 things that they thought were godless, to say the least. But still, they allowed journalists in for brief glimpses of what was happening in Afghanistan. And I felt every time I went, I was afraid, I was lonely, I was dirty, I was hot, I was miserable. I was constantly trying to do things that I could be arrested for, such as, for example, take a photograph or interview a woman. The very nature of journalism required that we do things that the government had said we could not do. So it was always a situation of enormous tension and difficulty. And yet every time I left, I thought, what an extraordinary privilege for me to have been in this remote, secluded part of the world. Here I am, the only woman, the only Westerner, sometimes even the only foreign journalist in a country that's shut off from the world. So it was always awful, and it was always extraordinarily enriching. And I would come out of there and collapse in a state of complete exhaustion when I got to Pakistan. And then I would sit down and write. And I wrote some of the most dramatic and meaningful stories of my career. So there are always 2 sides to this. One of the most difficult parts of being in Afghanistan under the Taliban was that we were not allowed to meet women. Women were completely off limits to journalists. The Taliban did not want the world to know what women thought or felt because they were very suppressed under that regime. And the most visible sign of that suppression was the burqa, which is a head-to-toe veil. I'm sure you've by now seen many pictures of them, that the women were required to wear, which completely covered them. And I had always been fascinated by the burqa, or rather what was behind it. I was obsessed with the burqa, or rather what I could not see behind it. I watched in fascination as Afghan women navigated the streets, encased in pleated nylon capes that billowed like spinnakers, but masked their eyes behind small mesh squares of crocheted cloth. I watched for clues, bracelets, stocking mesh, anything that would hint at the personality or background of the woman behind the veil. I wondered if they felt hot or angry or afraid, or simply safe from leering eyes and police oppression. So naturally, I eventually decided I had to try one on for myself. I decided the only way to pierce the veil separating me from half the Afghan population was to try on a burqa for myself. The chance came one day in a crowded bazaar in the city of Kandahar, where there were many burqa shops lining the muddy streets. I walked into one and introduced myself, of course with a translator, to the young proprietor. When I asked to try on a burqa, he laughed and said, of course, and helped me into a brand new bright blue cape. It weighed far more than I expected, and the face mesh squeezed tightly against my eyeglasses. Almost immediately, I tripped on the shop steps. Feeling foolish but determined, I hiked up the dragging skirts and set out along the sidewalk. Immediately, I was engulfed by a thick mist. It made me feel claustrophobic, off balance. The heat was stifling. I could barely breathe. I stumbled, cursing in anger and fighting off panic. I could barely see three feet ahead, and yet I had the acute feeling that every eye in the market was upon me. Suddenly I realized I had nothing to worry about, and I laughed ruefully to myself. Like every other woman in Afghanistan, I was now invisible. One of the ironies of my sojourn in South Asia and Afghanistan was that the first country I ever visited that was a Muslim society was Afghanistan under the Taliban, which means I had a completely skewed and extreme notion of Islam. And it wasn't until I finally got to Pakistan, which is a much more moderate society with a much more reasonable approach to Islam, that I realized that not all Muslim countries were like the Taliban. Pakistan is a very schizophrenic society. It's a country that's really pulled between a modernizing, moderating, globalizing future and a very conservative, a tribal, a feudal, and religious past. It's a country in very tumultuous transition, but a country on which I have not given up, although I know many people who have. I've had remarkable experiences in Pakistan. I've been in protests in which I was surrounded by young men wearing Islamic robes who were shouting, "Long live Osama bin Laden." I have interviewed mullahs who told me that all Western women were prostitutes, and surely I was one of them, and what was I doing in his mosque? But I've also made wonderful friends in Pakistan who were and are modern, moderate Muslims who dressed, this is a Pakistani shalwar kameez, which I'll show you. Hardly like a burqa. This is what most Pakistani women would wear every day. I've made many very close friends in Pakistan who've really taught me a lot about what Islam can be in the modern world. I also find that as a Christian, I've felt very drawn to mosques. Islam is a very contemplative, very meditative religion, and I've actually found myself finding real moments of peace in mosques. And I want to read you just a little bit about that. Not used to doing these readings, so you have to forgive me. The call of the Moisin is one of the most haunting, seductive sounds I have ever heard. Many times the first call, Fajr, has woken me from a half-sleep in Peshawar or Lahore before dawn, almost pulling me toward it. I imagined following the notes through the misty air and twisting alleys of a sleeping city to a cavernous, vaulted sanctuary where old men bowed and murmured in the warm, familiar gloom. Many times at dusk, hearing the first notes of Isha, the evening call, I have flung open my hotel window in Srinagar or Kandahar and leaned out, closing my eyes and listening until the last echo died away. Azan is both lullaby and awakening, a call to worship that slowly builds to an irresistible crescendo. First, a single quavering voice rises from one minaret, then a second gravelly one joins in a few blocks away. The voices multiply, blending into an endless hum, neither in harmony nor in competition. It is like a joyous chorus of the deaf who can hear only God and sing only to Him. These are the sentinels of a faith that moves to timeless rhythms and unchanging beliefs. God is great. There is no other God. Awake, arise, come and worship. That call has gone out for centuries, and I am far from the first Westerner to feel its lure. Islam is not my religion and never will be. I have seen far too much hatred and bloodshed and oppression perpetrated in its name, and I could never accept the limits it places on women. Even the mosque itself, the source of the siren's song that beckons me so, is off limits to women in most countries. And yet there is something appealing in the simple message, especially to someone caught up in the frantic modern pursuits, that says we should distill life to its essentials, slow down, set aside worldly things, and put God first. Having said that, I also had a number of experiences in Pakistan that were very frightening. It was in Pakistan that the Taliban were born. It was in Pakistan that the extreme notions of Islam first took root in South Asia and moved to Pakistan, to Afghanistan. In Pakistan, I heard for the first time this notion, which was appalling to me, but I heard it dozens of times, that, for example, people there believed that the Jewish people working in the World Trade Center had been warned in advance of the attacks and allowed to leave the building. This is ludicrous, and yet it's something that many, many people in Pakistan believe to this day. And so, just as we have our myths floating around, they had theirs as well. And, one of the sad things I found in visiting Pakistan and other Muslim countries is that people in these countries truly think we hate them, truly think that America and the West is against Islam, wants to destroy Islam. This is not true. But circumstances, events, ideology, all kinds of things have conspired to make people believe this. I think as a journalist that even though my job is to write about what people say, what they do, the things that happen, conflicts that occur as a result of terrorism, all these horrible things that I've had to cover, I still want to be a bridge. I still want to be a person that reaches out. I still want to be an emissary between cultures and worlds. I actually think that's a much more valuable thing to do. My bread and butter is writing about conflict and difficulty and struggle and oppression. But as David was saying in his introduction, and as I'm really trying to do in this book, and that's why I call it Fragments of Grace, I set out to find wherever I can the smallest moment, the smallest gesture, the individual that will redeem me, that will redeem the experience of being in these awful places. Throughout the book, I describe these moments. One that comes to mind in Pakistan is going to a center for drug addicts in Lahore and finding a man with no legs who was the happiest man I'd met in years. He had found a new life. In Nepal, I covered this horrendous massacre of the royal family and spent 24 hours a day writing about this horrendous event. And it wasn't until I was about to leave the country and stopped for the afternoon to visit a girls' orphanage and found this amazing communication with these young girls, and they all were clinging to me, and I wished I could take them all home. And I realized it was the first human moment I had spent in Nepal after I'd been there for 2 weeks writing about this grim and gruesome royal family murder. So I always try to find those things that will save or salvage humanity, that will allow my readers back home and allow myself to feel that it's been worth it, that it's been meaningful, that it's not just the news. This book is an effort to make some sense of my life, to give meaning to what I've done that's more than just cover the news. I want to talk a little bit about India. India is a marvelous place, and I lived there for several years. And I went through some amazing experiences there, unlike any other country. When you first come to India, it hits you in the face. It's dirty, it's hot, it's steamy, it's full of enormous crowds. You can barely breathe. You wonder what you're doing there. It's an enormous challenge. And then there's Hinduism, which is, strikes you at first like a circus, not like a religion. You go to a Hindu temple and it's full of animals and people, and it's like a bus station. It's like a child's entertainment. But if you stay long enough, you begin to really see what it means, what the Hindu faith means to people. And, my journey in India and in the Muslim world for these past 6 years has been very much of a spiritual journey. I don't mean an institutionalized religious journey. I mean something else. I have found so much in these alien religions that I could relate to, that meant something to me, that lifted me up in places, times I never ever thought it could happen. In my chapter about India, I talk a little bit about my first experiences with Hinduism sort of being so alarming, and there's this incident where a priest comes to bless my new house and almost sets it on fire by mistake. But then gradually I come to have a deeper appreciation. And this passage is too long to read, but I'll tell you, the family that worked for me in India, and I traveled across India in a train to baptize their son in the Ganges River. And it was one of the most extraordinary experiences of my life, just to be in the Ganges before dawn with this little boy. And I was baptized. We were probably most of us baptized, but this was a real baptism. I mean, this was all of us getting wet in the Ganges before dawn, and this little screaming boy whose parents, truly believed that this would protect him for life. It was just an amazing experience. So I really not only came to have great respect for India, but to really love it by the time I left. I just want to I'll read you one passage about India. It's not about religion, it's about something else. I love the monsoon. I love the word itself, long and low like a distant moan, evoking visions of cool, refreshing rains that sweep across the parched earth, bringing everything back to life. I never want it to stop, this drenching miracle from God. Driving along the flooded boulevards of New Delhi under the downpour, I see people crouched beneath fruit carts, crammed into telephone stalls, shrinking under trees, or simply standing and dripping. But for once, no one shoves, no one complains. People are smiling with gratitude and relief, as if the shower were washing away the sour, surly habit of urban living, along with months of dense, asphyxiating heat. The city can breathe again. I, too, need the rain. I need it to wash away my exasperation with traffic jams and tea-sipping bureaucrats and sidewalks that are human obstacle courses and office machines that never work and airports where well-dressed passengers insinuate themselves ahead of you in line and pretend that you do not exist. I need it to refresh my compassion for the people sleeping on cardboard scraps and the children begging beside stoplights at midnight, and for the gaunt, scarred teenager with the filthy nails who snatched my purse on the train to Rajasthan. It was amazing to me that no matter how many times I experienced cruelty and greed and incredibly exasperating bureaucracy and terrible turmoil, I've always found a way to be refreshed, whether it was by religion, whether it was by nature, whether it was just by someone I happened to meet. I always found those moments. But, they never got published in the Washington Post. They're in this book. Maybe they should have found a way to get into the Washington Post, but they kept accumulating in me, and I just felt I had to write them down. I never wrote about the monsoon, and yet it made me come alive. The last thing I want to read to you is something, again, about Afghanistan. It's a part of the book where I tried my hardest to put together experiences that I had in South Asia and Afghanistan with my own beliefs. This was very, very hard to do. It's easy to write a news story. It's easy to write about the Taliban, how awful they were. It's easy to write all these things. It's very hard to sit and think and feel, what does this mean to me? And how can I bring it alive to others? So this section of the book, I really try hard, and I hope I succeed. This chapter is called A Country Without Faces, and it's one of my last chapters about the Taliban. Under the Taliban, Afghanistan became a country without faces. Postage stamps showed nature scenes. The official currency featured engravings of mosques and shrines. Open-air market stalls were hung with posters of Mecca in 100 different angles, but there was not a single human face. The regime took its cue from the most revered Islamic figure of all, the Prophet Muhammad, whose face was described but never depicted in Muslim literature. In its zeal to create the perfect Muslim society and render complete deference to God, the Taliban sought to erase all temptations of human narcissism and idolatry and replace them with self-effacing humility. But it was my strong feeling that in doing so, they committed a terrible, terrible crime. I am haunted by the fading and forgetting of even the most powerful experiences, by what happens to memory when we die. I have met so many people who are refugees from memory, who never owned a photograph of their parents, whose homes and belongings were destroyed, who witnessed horrors or hardships they cannot bear to mention. It is my job to appropriate those memories, to coax them out of hiding and into the consciences of distant readers. But what about the family tales I missed back home while prodding strangers for intimate details? Why did I never take the trouble to ask my own grandparents about their lives and times? When my parents are gone, who will keep their memories alive? I think of my mother's father, a refined old gentleman from Boston, who wore a mustache and a monocle, who smelled like pipe tobacco and sent me whimsical notes in the mail with drawings of animals. I only saw him at Christmas and on rare family occasions, and he died before I was old enough to know him. But I know that my mother adored him, and that when she was a young girl, he would promenade with her along Commonwealth Avenue, and she would feel like a princess. I think of my father's father, a genteel Baltimorean from a family of lawyers and judges. He was stern and old-fashioned, always lecturing us on our table manners. But he also had a twinkle in his eye. He wore a jaunty green bow tie, and he always told a joke about Justice Holmes and Justice Brandeis watching a pretty girl walk by and wishing they were 70 again. I remember him standing in front of the fireplace, swaying with his eyes closed and humming along to a scratchy recording of Madame Butterfly. Now they are both gone, and all I have left is their pictures to bring back the smell of Virginia tobacco, the melody of a Verdi aria, to preserve the fading legacy of a gentler, more upright generation. Robert Remington McCaffrey will always be there, with his mustache and his tie in an old red leather frame on the bureau. William Pepper Constable will always be there, with his green tie and his faded red cap hanging on my library wall. How would I feel if an armed police squad suddenly stormed into the house and tore up those pictures, ranting about idolatry and graven images? What happens to a family, to a society, when sentiment and memory and continuity are deliberately snatched away in the name of a higher, abstract belief? If there is nothing to inherit or pass on, does not the present become meaningless? I may convince myself I have been living for moments. I may be a rootless and restless person by biology, profession, and temperament. but without a history to cling to, without the faces of earlier generations to reflect upon, I think I would be truly lost. The Taliban may have thought they were glorifying God, but instead they stole a fundamental part of humanity, the right to remember the past, and that is what sealed their fate. Thank you very much. For those of you who are able to stay, I'd be very, very happy to answer all your questions. Sir.
Thanks for your very sweet talk. But from your experience in these areas, why do you think that there seems to be more violent conflict between what are primarily Christian and Islamic countries as opposed to, say, Christian and Hindu countries?
The question was, why is there so much violence in Islamic countries, and why is there a violent conflict between Islamic countries and Western Christian countries rather than from Hinduism or India? One thing I did not talk about in this in my readings was the miracle of Indian democracy. It is not only the world's largest, but I think the most remarkable democracy. There are 1 billion Indians, and the most humble villager you meet in India knows he or she has the right to elect leaders and to throw out bad ones and to protest when they're not happy about things. There is no alienation from the state. There's poverty. There's corruption, there are all the problems of the third world. But people in India feel, because it is a democracy, that they do have rights, and that's what keeps it a cohesive country. It's not Hinduism per se that keeps it a cohesive country and a peaceful one, although it is a religion that it is peaceful in what it advocates. So is Islam, by the way. I think it's democracy. And then by the other token, the Muslim societies I've been in, as I've said, the great majority of citizens are not violent, are not extremists. Over and over and over again, I've interviewed people in Pakistan and Afghanistan who say, please, read the Quran. Please listen to us. This is not a violent religion. This is a religion that believes in propagation by education and teaching, not by violence. The extremists who have used it to propagate violence are a fringe in all of these societies. They are not what I've found to be the mainstream in any way. I think it's a tragedy that terrorism has arisen as an international scourge, but it hasn't made me give up hope on Islam. I think that when you look at the way the countries are governed that are Muslim, many of them are dictatorships of one kind or another. The people feel alienated from the state. They don't feel represented. They are frustrated, and they turn to not only religion, but a radical version of religion as something to cling to. Any other questions? Ma'am? The question was about their education system in Pakistan and other countries. There are sort of two parallel education systems, the public one and the religious one. One of the main problems has been that in a country like Pakistan, very little money has been put into the public education system because so much has gone into defense, and so much has gone into defense because of this permanent paranoia about India, which is another topic. As a result, public education gets very little funding in Pakistan. And instead, you've had this amazingly quickly proliferating system of religious schools, which is where many of these extremist ideas have come from. Not all religious schools believe these extreme views, but many of them do. And it's the poorest it's the poorest the poorest and the most deprived young people who experience this. I have something here I read. I think I understand the powerful attraction of Islam, with its quiet sanctuaries, purifying ablutions, and rigorous striving for perfection, which has drawn hundreds of thousands of boys and young men, poor and illiterate, to fundamentalist mosques and madrasas. To memorize a sacred book in a mysterious language, to imagine dying a glorious death in defense of one's faith, to become a soldier of God and be assured of a place in paradise. How potent that elixir must be to someone with no money, no education, and no prospects for success in this world. Yes. The question was about where do I turn when I need stability and connection and reassurance in difficult places. Well, my first answer is probably not the deepest one, but email makes a big difference. When I started out as a foreign correspondent, there was no email, of course, and one did feel very cut off. But in the past couple of years, checking email every day has become a very, very important ritual. If I can't check my email at least once every couple of days, I feel like I'm really at the ends of the earth. But yes, of course, I have, friends. I mean, one of the great things about living in a country like Afghanistan for a period of time is that I've actually made friends that I can see again and again and again, which you can't do when you're jumping from crisis to crisis. Some Afghan, some foreign. And it's building those friendships that really become an anchor when you're far away like that. Only in one place did I actually find a church to go to, and that was in Islamabad. There was a Protestant church in Islamabad that I went to whenever I was in town, which wasn't all the time, but sometimes, and it was a very plain, simple church. I liked going there. Most of the people who went there were teachers, English teachers, and we got to be friends. In fact, I talk about the church in the book, not because I went there, but because, when 9/11 happened, I was in Africa. I was very far away from those events. And when I saw the World Trade Center falling down on television, I just didn't connect. I didn't relate to it. But in 2002, that little church I went to in Islamabad was bombed. And people were killed, and most people at that Sunday service, was Palm Sunday, were injured. And I was so angry, and it was a terrorist attack, and it affected me in a way that the World Trade Center never, ever could, because these are my friends, and it was my church. It was a very powerful incident for me, which is also in the book. And that had been a real anchor for me, that little place. And I was very angry that somebody took it away. You really want to open up that can of worms, as they say? That's also a very long topic. The epilogue to my book, which was written, obviously, at the end, talks a lot about that. I had been away for a very long time, very much cut off from American society and culture and events. And when I came back last year to write my book, I was shocked at the changes that I saw in American society. I was shocked at how paranoid everyone had become, and how, you'd ride in the subway and you're getting warnings about not picking up packages. I mean, everything had changed. I was very upset by it. I was very upset by the change in attitudes. I was upset by what happened to my friends. I had a very close friend from Pakistan who was a newspaper editor who had a fellowship at the Brookings Institution, which is an incredibly respectable thing to do. He was arrested in his office for some complicated problem with his visa. They just took him away. I mean, eventually he got out. But, I mean, it was the edge. It was the 9/11 sea change in not only policy but attitudes that I found so difficult to live with. And I mean, now we've seen far worse things that have happened. And I'm very concerned about all of it. I don't really want to get into a discussion of foreign policy, and my book is not a book about foreign policy. And there are other people far more qualified than I to talk about it. But as I said earlier in my talk, I like to think of myself as a bridge, as an emissary, as a way to bring cultures together and even religions. And it's really pained me to see the opposite happening. Yes. Yes, I made the decision some time ago that I wanted to come back to the States for a while. A long list of reasons. But I think the immediately precipitating reason was my last tour of duty in Iraq, which was especially violent and seemed especially senseless. Getting back to your question, wasn't sure what I was doing there or what we were doing there, which I never felt in Afghanistan, because you drive around Afghanistan, 99% of the people are delighted to meet you, and they offer you so many cups of tea you can't bear it. In Iraq, most of the people you meet, would just as soon shoot you. Very, very difficult place to be and a very difficult time. And I think it was during that trip that I finally decided that I wanted to come back for a while. I think eventually I'll probably go abroad again. A lot of things I'd like to do. But I think it's time. I think it's time to put down a few roots, to take care of a few weeds in my garden. Yes? Actually, some of them you have. Some of these more positive things I have turned into stories, and others do too. But news is news, and unfortunately, much of what we think of as news and institutionally treat as news is negative. Conflict is news. For every 10 stories about conflict, you get to write one about, the orphanage. That's just how it is. I can't say whether it's, reader-driven or editor-driven or market-driven or television-driven. There are a lot of things you can say. But, the bigger the headline and the more devastating the news, the more people read it. And yet what's so interesting to me is that the responses I get from readers to my personal stories, to these kinds of stories, are so much greater and so much more meaningful, and people constantly are writing saying, oh, this is so wonderful, I was able to feel and think and, visualize you and what you went through. So individually, readers really respond to these human interest stories, but what drives the news, unfortunately, is conflict and matters of life and death. Yes?
Given all your experiences in various cultures, religions, societies, countries, etc., do you come away from all of that with any degree of optimism that we humans are going to be able to coexist on this earth?
I'm sorry, optimism about what?
That we humans are going to be able to coexist.
Humans? Yes, but again, I'm afraid that's if I have grounds for hope, it has to do more with individual relationships than with state-to-state relationships or international relationships. I mean, obviously, leaders can do a lot to help or hurt. We can decide we want to be friends with France or not. We can decide many things. It's another big question, isn't it? I don't really know how to answer that, except to say that I am a permanent optimist in spite of all evidence around me. I think it has to do more with chemistry than anything else. If I were a cynic, I wouldn't be doing this job, and I don't think cynics should do my job. I've confined cynicism to other professions, I hope. Yes?
What's happened with those madrasas in Pakistan? Are they being less funded by I know the government has something to do with allowing it. I'm not quite sure to what extent they fund the schools, but it seems to me that would go a long way toward having more optimism as to what's going to happen in the future.
The government of Pakistan is trying to modernize the curriculum of these religious schools and to open them up and to have, for example, get them computer training and require them to teach English and do a number of things that would help modernize them. But they are private. I mean, these are religious institutions, and there's an enormous population percentage of the population that supports them. It's a very delicate issue. It's not something the government can just decree to change. And the government, even though it's a military government, is very wary of alienating the religious sectors of society. So it's kind of a work in progress. But I agree with you. I think it would be a very positive step if they could bring more changes to those schools. Any other questions? I think that's it. Thank you very, very much.